I would try to pretend that I'm a lot younger than I am, but given what he said twice, it's pretty hard to do that. Okay. I do remember, however many long years ago that was, sitting in the very chairs you're sitting in. I mean, not literally this room, but I was an M.B.A. student at the Wharton School, which is in the United States. And I did it as a full-time rather than in the way that you're doing it in the executive program. So I was there for 2 years, and at some point during those 2 years, I took a course called Organizational Behavior or Organizational Psychology or something like that. I was in that school because I was a lost youth, more or less, and so my father said to me, "Why don't you go to business school?" I said, "Okay." I had nothing else to do, so I went there because I didn't know what to do with my life. I found it interesting. Everything I studied I found interesting. Microeconomics, macroeconomics. I loved the work I did on collective bargaining, industrial relations. It was just fascinating to me. So I was very much interested in it all. But at some point I took a course, as I said, in organizational psychology. And suddenly it just hit me on the side of the head that this is the most interesting stuff I've ever encountered. Why don't I just do that? So I did. I finished the M.B.A. and applied to graduate school in psychology in a psychology department. And the thing that I had found most interesting in organizational behavior were questions of motivation. So what I did is to just focus on motivation. I had an amazingly wonderful advisor who essentially from the day I arrived said, "Ed, whatever you want to do, just do it. The things that interest you, those are the things to go to. And if you find it in psychology, fine. If you need to go into the organizational literature, the educational literature, sociology, any place that you can find material that are relevant to the questions that interest you, then just get it and do it and use it and make a path for yourself." I tell you that story because it was hugely important to me to have him relate to me in that way. And in a sense, ever since, the work that I've been doing somehow reflects how that advisor I had, Victor Vroom, treated me when I was a student. So I got there. Motivation is what I had in my mind, and so that's what I did. I found it wherever I could. At the time, motivation in the field of psychology, there was a period in which the study of motivation died. It had to do with the historical things that were happening in psychology that I won't bother telling you about. But there was a period in which there was no field of motivation. That's why Victor said, you know, find it wherever you can find it. And so what that meant is I went against the grain of what was happening, just found what interested me, and then worked ongoingly with various other people to again create a field of motivation within psychology that was wholly different from what it had been before. So really that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Let me think, I have to remember how to, oh yes, with the arrows down here. Okay, so motivation. The question is, what is motivation in a sense? And for me, the answer to that in the simplest terms is, it's what energizes your behavior. What is it that gets you up in the morning and moves you through the day? That's motivation. And so there are lots of different kinds of motivation. I mean, different of you may have different experiences getting up, But the issue of motivation is all about that energy and where it comes from and how we facilitate it and so on. Traditionally, in psychology, in economics, and even if you talk to people on the street and bring up the word motivation, it has been treated as a unitary concept. What I mean by that is people think about motivation as something that differs in amount. You have less motivation or you have more motivation. And that's really the way it's treated. When people hear that I study motivation, they come to me and say, how can I get my kids more motivated to do their schoolwork? How can I get my employees more motivated to do their work, and so on. It's always thought in terms of amount. Economists do that. They use the term incentives instead of motivation, but everything is about incentives, and it doesn't matter what the incentive is, but they want more of it rather than less of it. From the very time I started studying motivation, I thought, this doesn't seem right to me. And it didn't seem right to me because I was, I don't know, 20 years old, 20-some years old, and I had had experiences in life, as have you. And when I think about motivation or other things, one of the things I pay attention to are the experiences that I've had myself. So I'd think about having been a student. I'd been a student more or less all my life up to that point. And I remembered classes that I was in where I was just hugely engaged in what was going on. I was excited to be there. I was interested in whatever it was that was going on in the class. Something about it was hugely energizing for me. Okay, that was interesting to me that I'd had those experiences. I had been in other classrooms where it was a drag to be there. I didn't find it interesting. I didn't find it compelling. The teacher wasn't able to bring me into it in a way that got me involved. But I was still motivated. Why was I motivated? Because I was a dutiful son. My parents wanted me to be doing well in school, and I wanted to be pleasing my parents. That was the motivation, clear and simple, for why I was there and why I was trying. But I knew that my experience there was so different from what it had been in these other classes that I told you about. How do I then put that together with the notion that motivation is really about amount when somehow it seemed to me it was about kind? I had in some way, I didn't know how to deal with it, but in some way I'd had a different kind of motivation in some classes from the kind of motivation that was centrally operative in others, and that seemed important to me. And so really, from that time on, I've always been thinking about motivation in terms of kinds of motivation, more so than just the total amount of motivation that you have. So that's the whole issue of differentiating motivation. Now, as Avi said, I work with a theory which we call self-determination theory. So we'll be bumping into that term all the way through. And usually for short, I just say SDT. So that's what it means. Within SDT, one of the central premises is that you have to think about motivation in differentiated ways. In other words, different kinds. And in fact, if you really get into the theory and the minutiae of it interests you, you'll find that we have a lot of differentiations. But you can, for starters at least, take all of those differentiations and actually look at just one that kind of encompasses all the rest. we think about the primary differentiation with two terms. It has to do first with autonomous motivation. So let me say a few words about that. Autonomous motivation means that you're doing an activity in a way that you're fully engaged with it. You are wholly willing to be doing this. You experience in the moment as you're doing a task, not that you're saying this to yourself, but it's as if you were, I choose to be doing this task in this moment. I am here for this. I endorse doing it. I concur with doing it. You have this whole sense of willingness, and with that, a sense of engagement that follows from it. If you ever have that experience in your jobs, I'm sure you do, you wouldn't be here if you didn't, you have at least times when the experience you're having is one of real willingness to be doing what you're doing. And I would say in those moments, you are being autonomously motivated. And as I go back to my experiences that I told you about in education, in those classes where I was so enthusiastic, so present, so engaged, I now think of my motivation as having been what we call autonomous motivation at that time. In contrast, we have controlled motivation. When your motivation is controlled, it means either that you've been coerced to do what you're doing, and we certainly have lots of experiences, or have had in our lives, lots of experience of coercion. I mean, people threaten us with punishments if we're not doing something, for instance. That's a form of motivation that some people turn to a lot. That's what I would call coercion. Or they bombard us with language that's full of words like should, what you should be doing, what you have to do now, what you must do or ought to do. All of that language, all of those words are words that convey the notion of control. It's some other person trying to control you in terms of what you're doing. In fact, I think the word motivation, when it gets used a lot, is really just a euphemism for the word control. Because when a lot of people think about motivation, what they have in mind is really trying to control somebody else. There we have the primary distinction, and of course it will be coming up as we continue on through this. Now, what you have on this slide is the results of literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces of scientific research that have been published in various psychology journals, management journals, and so on over the years that I and many other people have been working on these sorts of things. But I took them all and put them right there. So I'll take a couple of minutes to tell you what's taken it feels like centuries, decades to accumulate. This is all about what happens when people are more autonomously motivated versus less autonomously motivated. So we're looking at relations here. When people are more autonomously motivated, there is greater persistence at whatever they're doing. So if it's a particular task right now that you have to do, and you're more autonomously motivated, you're likely to persist at it longer than people who are less autonomously motivated. But it also goes into a larger scope than that. I'll tell you about one study, for instance, around this issue of persistence. And this was a study of very elite swimmers in Canada. These were the people who were competing to be in the Olympics, competing to be national champions. They were the very best swimmers that existed in that country at a particular time. And they came from many different cities across the country, and they had different coaches. What was being studied there is the type of coaches and the way the coaches were treating the people who were working, the swimmers who were working with them, but the focus was on the swimmer's motivation. Some of the swimmers were motivated in what we call very controlled ways, and others were motivated in what we call autonomous ways. What was found is we looked at the people over what we call in a longitudinal way over time, looking at them on 3 different occasions, about 10 months between each of the assessments. Those people who were low on autonomy in their motivation but were more controlled in their motivation, we found that a high percentage of them within a year of the time we first assessed their motivation, a high percentage of them had literally dropped out of their sport by the time we came back a second time, and then when we were there the third time, the percentage got even greater. In other words, imagine that you're that good that you're actually in the running for perhaps being on the Olympic team, and yet you're doing it for this kind of motivation that's more controlled rather than autonomous. They just gave up at it, the people who were there out of controlled rather than more autonomous sorts of reasons. So what I'm saying, it's all part of this first thing of autonomous motivation predicts persistence when you look at it in all different kinds of ways. Another thing that's important here is that when people are autonomously motivated for something, they're more creative in the way they do it. We've studied this in art activities as well as many other things, but artists who are more autonomously motivated create art that's judged by experts as being more creative. It also relates to how they think, and we use terms like cognitive flexibility. That means you think in more flexible kinds of ways. We have a term in the United States that gets used a lot. It's perhaps familiar to you, of thinking outside the box. Have you ever heard that as a phrase, for instance? That's the idea of being more flexible in how you think about things. The degree that people are autonomously motivated leads to their being higher in terms of this flexibility, this thinking outside of the box. And what that means is when they encounter problems in what they're doing, they're more able to solve the problems in new and different ways, of finding ways of getting around the obstacle that for whatever reason has been put up in front of them. We find, for instance, that overall in terms of performance, people perform better at their jobs when they're more autonomously motivated. Yes?
Can you please elaborate on the measures that you look at for comparing a person who's autonomous or...
For the motivation? Yes. There are various ways of doing it, but some of it is in terms of their reports to us. So we ask you questions. So we'll say, I mean, in the simplest form, I'll say, why do you do your job? Or in more specific ways, depending on at what level of specificity we're studying something. So I'll just stick with, why do you do your job? And then I'll give you a number of answers for that. And you rate each answer. So I'll say, so one of the possible answers to why do you do your job is, I do it only because I need the money and that's a way of paying my rent or something of that sort. How true is it for you that that's the main or only reason that you're really doing your job? If you're saying on a scale, you know, like you've got a numeric scale from 1 to 7 where 1 would be, this is not true for me at all, to 7 where this is exactly hits the nail on the head for me. If your ratings tend to be more up on the 5, 6, 7 range, that's an indication of some substantial amount of controlled motivation for you. Other kinds of answers would be something like, I find this work very interesting and I believe myself that it's really personally, for me personally, this is very important work to be doing. I have a sense of it having some real meaning to me. And again, you'll be rating that on a scale. I mean, there'll be a lot of these questions, but I'm just giving you 2 examples. And if you're rating that one really high, that's an indication of more autonomy in your motivation. So we all have some of each kind of motivation, but it's a matter of how strong the different ones are. So that's the easiest way to do it, is just in your reports about your own motivation, and then we, you know, combine the various answers statistically and so on to make predictions about some other type of whatever it is we're trying to predict from it.
So there's some kind of oxymoron here, because
okay.
I'm a little bit concerned as a
yeah.
manager. You know, I want all these good outcomes. I want my people to be healthy and enjoy their works and have creativity. But is this sheer luck? So if I'm assuming that if people are coming the way they're coming, the way they are brought, whether they are autonomously motivated or controlled motivated is something that it's only dependent on luck, whether I control their motivation or whether people are coming with or without motivation. How can I impact autonomous motivation? How can I drive people to this direction? Or is it just, you know, the way they are born?
Yep. Thank you very much. You have just given the outline of my talk. I could have put it on the first slide, but I didn't need to because you did it for me. That's exactly where we're going.
All right,
so,
yeah.
I'll be patient. Okay. I mean, if you get impatient, just yell at me again, and, you know, that's okay. Okay, so you see the performance. I mean, some of that is actually performance done by managers that go into the company records. You know, we get performance in lots of different ways, but that's an example of it. Certainly it's the case that people who are more autonomously motivated enjoy their work. That's almost a given in all of this. But now also there's a lot of research, and I'll tell you a little bit about it later on, indicating that people who are more autonomously motivated are psychologically healthier. I mean, we use terms like well-being, mental health, all of those sorts of things. That means less anxiety, less depression. It means more sense of self-esteem, feelings of worth, and so forth. All of these things over and over have been shown to be related to autonomous motivation. And it's also the case, although I'm not going to talk much about this, so I could because it's one of the things that interests me most at the moment, and that is close personal relationships. I assume most of you either have a spouse or a partner or a romantic relationship, or you've been in and out of them or whatever, but that's one of the things I've been studying a lot lately, and best friends, what goes on between best friends. And there are a lot of people, including psychologists, who say that in order to have a high-quality relationship, you have to give up your autonomy in service of the relationship. I think I hear that and I say, oh, come on, you can't really mean that. If I give up my autonomy, then I'm giving up my willingness to be here and beginning to experience that I'm here because I have to. What we find is that the highest quality relationships are ones in which each partner is there feeling a full sense of autonomy about being there. And in fact, the indicator of the best relationships are ones where each partner respects, appreciates, and supports the autonomy of the other partner. That kind of mutuality is what predicts the highest quality personal relationships. I threw that in just because I thought maybe you'd find it a little interesting, even though it's not exactly on the main thrust of what organizational behavior is about. And then I would just say that sometimes people say, oh, autonomy, that's a Western concept. It's not relevant to people in the East. Or they say autonomy, men like autonomy, but women don't. And somehow to try and take the idea of autonomy and shrink it down to be relevant to just certain kinds of people. What we find is, again, looking across these studies, we do studies in Korea and China and the Far East. We do studies in Israel with the Bedouin as well as Jewish populations and different places to try and go across all of these different demarcations that get set up. And we find that autonomy is important at all ages. There are certain psychological theories that say autonomy is a really big thing for kids who are like 2 or 3. I don't know if you have your own kids or not, but the sort of, we have a term in the US called the terrible twos, where the kids are so insistent on doing it their own way. So they say, okay, well, autonomy is big for 2 and 3-year-olds, and maybe it emerges again for adolescents if you've had adolescents that you've dealt with yet and their own desire for autonomy, so it seems. But the point is that the findings that are all here, we find across the ages, from preschool children to elementary school to high school to college to graduate schools to the workplace to the health clinic and so forth. So it's across ages, it's across genders. We find no appreciable differences in terms of what autonomous motivation predicts for women than it is for men. Same thing, socioeconomic status, level of wealth, for instance. It doesn't matter. Autonomy makes a difference for psychological health and well-being and for performance in them and, again, cultures. Okay, so more or less I've told you the story, or at least most of it. Does
it amount to the same amount for higher level managers and low level employees, for example, across the organizational hierarchy?
Yes, it does, actually. That regardless where you are in an organizational hierarchy, if you are there with the experience of volition and willingness, the motivation that I have for being here in this job, whether I'm running a machine or I'm running a corporation, if it's one that's really emanating from myself, it's coming from my interest in this activity and my belief in the importance of this activity or set of activities, of course, that I'm engaged in, the more you're in that place of experiencing this sense of willingness, of interest, of belief in its personal value, the more it has positive effects on what you do, how well you do it, and in terms of your own adjustment and wellness. Okay, so I've said a little bit about autonomy, and before I go on, I want to make the point of what autonomy is not, so that helps clarify really what it is I'm talking about. Autonomy does not mean independence. If you get out the dictionary, I'm turning pages, I'm a little behind the time. If you get out the dictionary and look up autonomy, one of the definitions that you come to might be independence. So I'm not talking about language here. What I'm talking about is that when I'm using the term, I'm using a very specific definition of it. It's the definition that I've said about volition, willingness, endorsement of your own activities and behaviors. I don't mean independence. And I say that because lots of people think about autonomy as independence, and that's perfectly appropriate that you do that, but not when you're looking at this kind of thing and talking about this. So people argue with me sometimes about autonomy and other groups of people not needing it and so on, and they're thinking of it in terms of independence. I'm talking about it in terms of volition and endorsement, and it's ridiculous to be having an argument when two people are talking about different things. Okay, so I've now said what autonomy is not as a way of keeping us focused, so let's move on. Let me say another thing with respect to it to even clarify it more. It is possible for people to be autonomously independent. You can be independent and do it autonomously in the definition of what we mean by autonomy. That is to say, you can, at some times with some tasks and so on, you can be very independent. You can be, as we say, the rugged individualist, going a little alone on this activity, for instance, and do that very autonomously. So you can be autonomously independent, but you can also be autonomously dependent on others. And indeed, I hope you are. I hope you have a spouse or a partner or a best friend or a next-door neighbor who you can quite willingly turn to if you're feeling some stress or upset, for example, that you have people to rely on, that you have people in your life that you depend on, and you do that in a fully autonomous way. Okay, so autonomy and independence. Autonomy, as I describe it, and independence means our language for it in statistics is orthogonal. They're sort of crossing each other. They are not the same thing, and they also are not antagonistic toward each other. Okay, there's one other extremely central and important concept in self-determination theory that I want to point to now. And that has to do with the concept of needs. The concept of needs has been used in psychology by lots of different writers, and it gets used in different ways. One of the ways that it gets used in psychology is we talk about people having physiological needs. What happens to you if suddenly your supply of oxygen gets cut off? You are incredibly motivated to get that back because your life, your health and well-being depends on your getting oxygen. Oxygen is a need of all human beings. Water is a need of all human beings. You can go without water longer than you can go without oxygen, but I wouldn't want to be in a situation that I was never going to have water again, or I wouldn't remain healthy for very long, and I wouldn't remain alive for much longer than that. I use these examples to convey the notion that when I use the word needs, I'm talking about essentials for health and well-being. Something, you need something if that something is essential for your effective functioning. Okay. Pretty much everyone would agree that we have biological or physiological needs, oxygen, water, and so forth. I'm suggesting in addition to that, we have psychological needs. Our minds have needs just as our bodies have needs. This is not a universal agreement. It is not the case that many psychologists agree with this. They'll pretty much all agree that there are physiological ones, but not psychological ones. I don't care whether they agree or not. You know, there are people in the world that are wrong about some things.
Maslow wrote a paper about it a while ago.
I didn't understand.
Abraham Maslow wrote a paper about it a while ago.
Abraham Maslow wrote a paper about it in 1943. Yes, it was a while ago. And he talked about different kinds of needs. They typically get referred to as lower order and higher order when people talk about Maslow. That's true. And the lower order are the more what we call deficit needs, and the higher order are more the growth-oriented needs. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs appears in virtually every introductory psychology textbook, and it has for 60 years or whatever that is. But most psychologists still don't believe in the notion of what in Maslow's terms were called the higher order needs or the psychological needs. So I am one of those people who subscribe to the idea that we do have psychological needs. That means needs which are essential for our effective psychological functioning. There are three that I think are important for everyone. I'm talking universally across cultures and so on. Whether your culture thinks they're important or not doesn't matter as far as I'm concerned, because what the data show are that whatever the culture you're in, it shows that if you satisfy these needs, you're healthier, and if you don't satisfy the needs, you're less healthy. Okay, here they are, the three. The first is competence. What's it like for you when you fail a test, and then you fail another test, and then you meet with your instructor, and your instructor says, you're really incompetent when it comes to this. Maybe you've made the wrong choice about what course to be taking or something. People, when they feel incompetent, it starts to affect their feelings about themselves. They start to feel depressed, discouraged, and so forth. Competence is a need that we all have. When it's satisfied, we feel great, alive, interested, vital, and so on. And when it's not, we feel negative consequences. Second need that is important is what we call autonomy. So I've been saying, talking about autonomous motivation, what I'm adding here is that all of us need to feel autonomous to some significant degree in order to remain healthy, alive, vital, excited, and so forth. It's a psychological need. And the third need that's important is the need for relatedness. That means we need to feel like we belong in groups. A group might be a group of 2 people, for instance, or it may be a broader group than that. We need to feel cared for by other people, and we need to care for those other people. It goes both ways. This general sense of love, of friendship, all of it I consume under the notion of relatedness. Human beings have a need for relatedness. Okay. The important point is you'll see from this is that when people have these needs satisfied, first they tend to be more autonomously motivated, which then in turn has the kinds of consequences that I've already laid out for you. Second, that when they get these needs satisfied, they tend to be healthier at the psychological level and also at the physical level. It has a direct impact on physiology as well as just psychology. And all of the kinds of things that I said about autonomous motivation, when these needs are satisfied, because it facilitates autonomous motivation, it facilitates all those other things that I had in the summary slide for you. Okay, so now you've had most of the key points of self-determination theory. All this is doing is saying what the psychological needs are, and I've already said that, so I'm just going to move right on. Now getting to autonomous motivation in a more specific way. Again, we're doing a little more differentiating here rather than just sticking with autonomous and controlled motivation. I want to go into autonomous motivation a little more deeply and talk about two different kinds of autonomous motivation. They're referred to as intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation that's been well internalized, but let me take them one at a time and say what they mean. Intrinsic motivation means doing an activity because you find the activity interesting and enjoyable. Some people play golf and love playing golf. If you happen to be one of those people, my hunch is nobody's going to ask me, how do I motivate you to play golf? You love golf. You're just out there doing it. You're hoping for more time, looking for more time to do it. That means if you are such a person, you're intrinsically motivated for that activity. And it may be that you play the cello or who knows what you do and as activities that you really love. But when you're doing activities that you really love, that's intrinsically motivated. It is the prototype of being autonomous. You feel absolutely willing and endorsing of the activity that you love to do. That's intrinsic motivation. The purest and interesting form of it, I'd be happy to hear what you say if you want to, or it's okay if you don't, but no, okay. The purest form of it and the easiest place to see it is with young children. Look at a 2-year-old playing. Do you ever hear anybody ask a question like, how do I motivate my 2-year-old to play? All of the motivation is there. That's what they do. It's like playing is life's business for them. They'll play with anything. You buy them an expensive toy, and it comes all wrapped up, and they tear open the paper, and they have fun with the paper, and then they take this beautiful toy out of the box and play with the box. It doesn't matter, the box, the toy, it's all the same. Now you can use anything to play with. The motivation, this thing called intrinsic motivation, is inherent in all of us. The specific things that we may be interested in varies from person to person as a function of the abilities that you have. I mean, Mozart was writing music when he was 4 years old. He had a level of competence in that was so overwhelming that it absolutely kept him focused on that as practically the only thing he ever did in his life. Well, competence, inherent competence makes a difference. The things that are available to us. If you grow up at the seashore, you're going to have different interests on average than if you grow up in the mountains, for instance, because different things are available to you. So there are lots of things that influence what we're interested in, but whatever it is that we're interested in, there's intrinsic motivation there to be doing it. What I hope is in your jobs, there are a substantial percentage of the specific things you do that you find interesting and enjoyable. That'd be great. When we talk about intrinsic motivation, and you find it in books, it's pretty much always contrasted with the idea of extrinsic motivation. The key point in extrinsic motivation is that you're doing a behavior for some separable consequence. A reward, for example, the avoidance of punishment, getting social approval. Extrinsic motivation, in its sort of simplest form, is what we call the carrot and stick. You've probably heard that expression. So we dangle carrots in front of people to get them motivated. We stand behind them with sticks to get them motivated. That's the sort of classic type of extrinsic motivation. Okay, now, the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation got made in the management literature back in the 1950s. And there was a famous book in 1960 by Douglas McGregor that looked at these two types of motivation. And what he did, and you may have heard these phrases someplace too, he talked about two different approaches to management. One that's called Theory X management and one that's called Theory Y management. I don't know if you've ever encountered that, but Theory X management essentially has at its core the concept of extrinsic motivation. Manager's job is to plan, workers' job is to do what the managers have planned for them. And because by and large, according to the Theory X approach, workers are lazy and indolent, you've got to use motivators to get them to do it. Motivators, of course, are these extrinsic motivators. So you pay them according to how many piles of steel they've moved from this side of the room to that side of the room, or whatever it is that their task is. Implicit in that approach to management is this extrinsic kind of motivation. Yeah?
But isn't the intrinsic motivation also based on the feedback that we get, competence? So there is some
Yes, it is.
elements. I do something for the first time, I'm not feeling too sure about it, I get positive feedback, then we have a grade or a bonus, so I'm feeling better about it.
Absolutely. You're right. And I'll show you in a very short number of minutes just how you're right. And then you're saying, so what's implicit in what you're asking or saying, I think, is doesn't intrinsic motivation depend on the environmental circumstances as well? And the answer to that is yes, thank heavens it does, because the fact that it does is the answer to the question that was here, but it does in particular ways, and that's where I'm headed, is to differentiate the kind of ways that environments can facilitate intrinsic as an example of autonomy versus extrinsic as a more control kind of thing. So good point and good question, both. So, yeah, so I was saying that implicit in Theory X motivation is this extrinsic kind of motivational view in the Theory X management, I should say. And then just hopping back to intrinsic motivation for a minute, then in contrast, Theory Y motivation is built on the notion of intrinsic motivation and the belief that workers are not lazy indolent, but actually that they're interested in accomplishment because they feel a sense of personal satisfaction from it, and therefore if you manage them in ways that acknowledge that rather than think of them in the more extrinsic kinds of ways, it'll be more effective. Okay, so now when this distinction was introduced to the management literature, as I said, in the late 1950s, some theorists said, this is great. We've got two kinds of motivation here. What we should do is use them both, and then we've got a total of amount of motivation that's equal to the one plus the other, and it's the best of possible circumstances. What that would mean concretely is make their jobs interesting, that'll get them intrinsically motivated, and then pay them in very specific contingent ways. So the better this performance is in a quite concrete way, the more money you're going to get paid for doing it. It's sort of almost like the piece rate payment, but as you move up the ladder, it gets a little less specific than that, but still the notion of very contingent extrinsic payments. When I read that, again, I didn't really like it very well. I just thought there's something about this that doesn't feel right to me. So since my job as a psychologist is to do research, I thought, I'm going to check and see whether this is really true, what I'm reading in these management textbooks, for instance. And so I set up a situation that is the following. Imagine you're working on some really interesting activity. So I did it in terms of puzzles. I found kind of puzzles. This was with college students. The first study was with college students, you as the participants in this research. So I got puzzle solving activity that was interesting across every college student I showed it to. And so I brought people into the psychology laboratory and I put them into one of two what we call conditions. In one condition, I gave them a number of these puzzles to solve, and so they spent their time solving the puzzles. And they were quite willing to do it. They were very interesting. And at the end, they were still interested in it, and that was it. They were just there as this one group. The second group, however, when they came in, I gave them the same puzzles. Everything was the same about it except for one difference, and that was, I said, for each of these puzzles you solve, I'll pay you $1. Now, I point out that this was one of the very earliest studies that I ever did, which gives you a sense of the timing of it, the point of which is $1 was worth something then. Okay. So, what I found is those people who came in and worked on puzzle solving and might have made $3 or $4 or something like that as a function of how many they solved. After the whole thing was finished, I measured their intrinsic motivation. How interesting did they find it now? The people who had done the same puzzles and got no money for it found it very interesting at the end, just as they had at the beginning. But the people who got paid for it, their interest in the activity dropped dramatically over the course of the period when they were being paid for it. Somehow I actually undermined their interest in the activity by paying them to do it. And I also set up a situation for all of these people where afterwards there was a period, we call it a free choice period, in which they were in a room. There was some more of the same kinds of puzzles to solve, but there were other interesting things to do. Those people who had not been paid did the same activity. They just got on with solving more puzzles. The people who had been paid didn't return to the puzzles. They did other things instead. Somehow they had aligned themselves with this task, whereas initially they had viewed the task as something they did because it was interesting. Now they've come to see it as something they did because they were being paid for it. Once they get to that place, it means, amongst other things, they won't do it anymore unless you keep paying them. The trouble is, I mean, of course, in the workplace, you can keep paying people for doing things, but the trouble is that along with that dependence on the money comes the lack of interest in the activity itself. So we've really shifted, essentially, their motivation in a simple little study of paying them a few bucks. We've shifted their motivation from being more intrinsic to being more extrinsic.
Did
you check the amount of puzzles that were solved?
Yes, we did check the amount of puzzles that were solved, and there are a number of different studies that have done this. And what we find is either the number of puzzles was the same, or if there was any difference, the people who got paid solved fewer and did less, and depending on what the task is. I mean, there have been a lot of tasks. Wherever there's a difference in performance, the paid people actually performed worse than the people who were not paid. Now, there is a bit of exception to that. If it's a trivially easy task, then paying people, and you'll get them to do a whole bunch of them because that means they'll make more money. But if it's any task that requires, in a problem solving, you've got to figure out how to do it. That requires this sense of more flexible thinking and so on, and hence the people who are paid tend to do worse on the puzzle solving if there's any. Yeah, this was first here.
How did you recruit the first group to solve these puzzles? You have to get them into the classroom somehow or into the
It's a very common thing in universities that psychologists in particular, but other fields as well, do research, and they have participants and they get them in different ways depending. But one of the ways that they're gotten is that some courses like introductory psychology in most universities, part of doing the course is to be a subject in some research, because the course is teaching psychological research, and the belief is that it's important to be experiencing what it's like to be a participant in some of these kinds of studies. So they actually come into it as part of the learning experience. Now, okay. Well, I think where you were headed with that is, well, aren't they all then in some ways having some amount of extrinsic reason for being there, namely it's satisfying a course requirement? And the answer to that is yes, that is true. They are. But the thing is, that's constant for everybody.
No, but furthermore, you're telling them that they should come to solve the puzzle because it's interesting puzzles.
Well, no, I'm not telling them that. I'm just, they just come to experiment. So they're
have several experiments they can join, and you want to bring them to your experience.
But we don't tell them that beforehand. What would typically happen is there's just a title to the study. So
the professor, the name of the study, is something that motivates you. If you have a really nice name for your study, it's an internal motivation.
Sure. Okay. So we would call it puzzle solving experiment. Okay. So then what you've got is people, everybody is coming in because it's part of their course. That's true. And people are coming in because they may find puzzles interesting. Both of those things are true. The point is that they're true for all the people who come in. And what you do in an experiment is there are a lot of things that you hold constant across both groups in your experiment. And the thing that you then do is you change just one thing between the two groups. And because everything else is constant between the two groups, if you find that the dependent measure, the outcome, their intrinsic motivation in this particular case, is different, then you can attribute it to that one thing that was different. So your point is right, that there are other reasons that they're there.
So you had a puzzle solving activity, one which is paid, the other which is not paid, and you had...
They don't know about that. I'm sorry. And you say it again? You have...
They didn't know it beforehand?
Oh, no.
One is paid, one
No.
is not paid.
No, that's the whole idea. If they know it beforehand, then that's going to affect them. So if they know that people are going to get paid and they come in and don't get paid, then there's all of that.
But I think this is what reflects best what happens in our companies.
Uh-huh.
I mean, people do know about rewards that others are getting. So
Therefore,
might have been interesting to check the influence of the non-paid group knowing about the paid group.
Right.
And vice versa.
True. There are no people in your company, though, that are not getting paid. So that's the case. And therefore, the point that you bring up, which is an excellent point, is really something that's studied a lot also. And the term that's used for it being studied is studies of equity or inequity. So there are a lot of studies that have looked at people's motivation under conditions where they feel equitably paid versus inequitably paid. And there's no question whatsoever that if people feel like their pay is inequitable relative to others, that's a decidedly negative factor on motivation, absolutely. So when you're setting up pay systems in organizations, it's extremely important to be mindful of that, and as the designer of a system to be thinking about what's it going to be like for people in these jobs. Are they going to be feeling like they're being equitably paid or not relative to other jobs, and taking into account that some jobs require years of schooling to do them and others don't. All of those kinds of things are important and relevant, and they get summed up really by this notion of equity. So yeah, it's a very important thing there.
Does the question of equity also touches upon one-time bonuses, etc.? Not just as an MIB as well as the other guy in the next room, the other guy doing the same job at a different company, but also why did this guy get such a bonus? Absolutely, it does. Let me say a little bit about bonuses. One of the things we find in these studies, I've told you only one of, at one point, like 15 years ago, I went in the literature. I published the first set of studies that I did on this question in 1971. In the late 90s, I went in the literature and looked across all the psychological literature, and I found that there had been 128 experiments since the time that I did the first ones that have looked at the effects of extrinsic rewards on intrinsic motivation. Now, people differ this about it and that about it. Some are with children, some are with adults, some are payments as the reward, some are giving kids prizes as a reward. They change all different things. So when you've got so many that have been done, which involve thousands of participants, then you can look at, in a fine-grained way, because things are different, at these differences. It leads to the point that if you give rewards to people and they did not expect them while they were working on the task, so you come afterwards and say, oh, well, thank you for doing the task. I happen to have a reward here for doing it, and maybe it's a prize or money or whatever it is, but that's kind of equivalent to bonuses in a sense. Bonuses, initially at least, are something that you're not doing the job to get. In other words, you're not expecting it while you're doing the job. Turns out that unexpected rewards don't have the negative consequence in the same way. For the negative consequence, you have to get into the place of thinking, I am doing this task in order to get this reward. You have to have that experience of the clear contingency for the reward to undermine your intrinsic motivation. Okay, so that would suggest that things like bonuses wouldn't be detrimental in the same way that if I was making your pay specifically dependent on the things you do and how well you do them, for example, that the bonuses wouldn't have the negative effects. The only problem is in most organizations, bonuses aren't things that just once in a great while happen to appear. People come to expect them. And if you're expecting them, and if you have a sense of what the bonus was last year and so on, then it really turns into something pretty close to an expected reward and is no difference really. So the potential advantage of bonuses being unexpected in reality doesn't come into play. So the bonuses have some risk also of having negative consequences. And then it also gets you into this whole issue of equity, and is my bonus good enough relative to other people's bonuses, and all those dynamics that play a role on people's motivation come into play.
Is it the same for tasks that require thinking as well as tasks that require physical labor? If you were to pay me to run faster,
yes.
That's something I can do. I can actually run faster, but if you pay me to solve some algorithmic equation better,
yes.
if I don't have the knowledge, I just can't do it.
There is absolutely a difference here, and the difference, the language we use for it is there are algorithmic tasks and there are heuristic tasks. An algorithmic task is one in which there's a right answer. You do this step, this step, this step, and so on, and you get to the end. There's no thinking about it, and in any real sense. I mean, no kind of stepping back and understanding it and thinking about it this way and that way and what's the right thing. Heuristic tasks are one that are where there's not the clear algorithm. Those are the ones where you've got to solve problems and bring new ways to doing it and so on. And it is clearly the case that the heuristic ones, the ones where you're trying to solve problems, thinking about new ways of doing things and so on, the rewards, when you make them contingent, the contingency for heuristic tasks and rewards, the detriment is much greater there than is the case when it's algorithmic kinds of tasks. So simple things, straightforward things, running, you don't, well, I mean, if you're really, really into the highest level of runners, then there's lots of nuances to it, that's true. But generally, the fact of running just means put this foot in front of that foot and keep doing it a lot and doing it as energetically as you can. So yeah, I think if you pay people, if the payment they get is dependent on how fast they run, they'll run faster. In organizations, like the kinds of organizations that you're in, I think the important thing is you're dealing with issues of solving problems, of being fully engaged in the activity, and it's not just a matter of pulling a handle on some machine. We're at a time in which the nature of what business is much more about heuristic ways of thinking and doing than about algorithmic ways. And yes, the things that I'm talking about apply more clearly to the one case than the other. When it comes to learning, for example, we can pay people to learn or give them prizes or give them A's and whatnot, use extrinsic rewards for learning. And people will learn under conditions of extrinsic rewards, that's true. Their motivation under conditions of clear extrinsic rewards is more controlled rather than autonomous, to go back to that language. It turns out that when people's motivation for learning is controlled, what they do is memorize facts. Memorizing facts is a useful thing, there's no doubt about it to some extent. But when people are autonomously motivated to learn, they learn conceptually. They learn in a way that they understand the relationship between facts. They understand the theme of what this issue is that we're working on here. So they're learning, in both cases, they'll be motivated to learn, but the quality of the learning is different. So again, and it's with the more conceptual kind of learning where the controls are more problematic than with the rote memorization. I've already spoken about this, so I'll just summarize it in 10 seconds, and that is, I told you we found 128 experiments in the literature. There's a statistical way of combining data across different experiments. It's called a meta-analysis.
Do reward studies apply also on achievement
A what program?
The Salesman Achievement Program.
Oh, Sales Achievement Program.
10%
Commissions. I know the least about sales of any other aspect of organizations. And I've never studied it, so I don't have data that I could bring to bear in answering the question. And I know sales, unlike every place else, has been so traditionally focused on commissions, where your pay is a direct function of how much you sell. And I know that any attempt to make changes there would take a system that's been solidly in place for a very long time and throw it into some amount of chaos. And I'm just not in a position to speak to it. I have some thoughts about it, but I would never make any kind of a recommendation in terms of what you should do with sales departments, presuming that they're ones that have been on commissions as the central aspect of their compensation throughout time. Oh, so all I was going to say about this is that across all the experiments, we end up finding that there, in fact, is, from tangible rewards now, undermining of intrinsic motivation, with studies done in various countries. Some of the people who did studies didn't like our studies because they didn't like the findings that we got, so they were invested in redoing the studies so that they wouldn't come out the same way. And in spite of all of that, it's still, when you collapse the data from all of them, it still showed the undermining. Were you gonna? Did you want to say something? Oh, okay. Very quickly here, why is it that I think tangible rewards have this negative effect on intrinsic motivation? As I told you, people become dependent on the rewards. They'll continue the activity if they get the rewards, and they'll stop doing the activity if they don't. The fact that you become dependent on some external contingency means that you're not being autonomous. Well, if we really think you have a need to be autonomous, to be really deciding for yourself and moving from your own motivation, if we suddenly set up a situation so now you're dependent on external things to be motivating you, then your experience is going to be one of losing any sense of autonomy that you might have for that. So this takes us back to the early point about psychological needs, and this is an instance where something that we think of as a motivator actually thwarts rather than satisfies our psychological need for autonomy, and our understanding is that that's really the basis by which this kind of detrimental effect occurs. Let me just check on time, and at what point do we want to break in this?
Break now for 15 minutes.
Yeah, would you like that? Okay, so let's do that. Okay, I would like to make two more points about rewards and then move on to other things. The first is, I fully understand that people come to work to get paid. I'm not in any way suggesting we shouldn't pay people. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't pay people a lot. I am suggesting that the payments we give be equitable for the people given what they bring to the job. That's clear. The thing that I'm suggesting is that the rewards be relatively non-salient. You're being paid for coming to work in the morning and working through the day. The minute you begin to see the rewards as a way of motivating performance, that's what gets you into trouble, because that's when people start to look at the activities they're doing as a means to a reward, and that's when the problem really comes into play. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that when you use rewards for motivating anything, the studies show that the thing that happens is people tend to take the shortest route to getting those rewards. And the shortest route is often not what we want. Remember Enron? The directors of Enron decided to use stock options to motivate top management to make the company stronger and healthier. The top management thought, what's the shortest path to get the gazillions of dollars that these stock options could be worth? Artificially inflate the value of the company. Artificially inflate the value of the stock so they can unload theirs, and that's the end of it for them. And we all know what happened to the company and the people who work there. They all paid the cost for this very thing, which economists were suggesting is the right way to go about motivating top managers. Okay, so quickly now, let me buzz through a whole bunch of things. Some other things, I've focused on rewards, but threats of punishment do the same thing, only probably worse because they have all kinds of emotional stuff that gets stirred up besides. Deadlines, evaluation, and competition all have negative effects, and especially negative effects when there's a lot of pressure on people to do these things. I mean, competition, you say, how could I say that about competition? It's so much involved in the workplace, and not to mention the sport fields. The thing about competition is it turns people against each other. If you have any need in your workplace to be having teams rather than individuals, the whole idea of competition turns them against each other rather than facilitating the process of supporting each other, of listening to each other, of working together to make something happen. Again, it's all this different kind of focus. What kinds of things can make a difference? I'll just give you a couple of instances now and a few more later. Providing people choice. Allowing people to think about new ways of doing things for themselves. Encouraging people to take responsibility. When people have choice about what they do, how they do it, when they do it, the intrinsic motivation is much higher than when you tell them what to do, when to do, and how to do it. Acknowledging feelings, paying attention to what's going on inside other people. I know you've heard in this class about the idea of listening. Do you really listen to the other people you're working with? And can you, when you're talking to them, when you are talking to your subordinates, for instance, do you have any interest in how they see things? To the extent that you have interest in how they see things and acknowledge that, for example, then they're going to feel like you're being supportive of them and of their own sense of autonomy. When you're not listening and you're relating to them only from your perspective, they're going to feel run over. The running over is not going to help their motivation. Okay. Now, feedback. Positive feedback enhances intrinsic motivation. So another thing that you do to keep people interested, involved, and engaged is provide feedback. You do it in very specific ways. That is to say, you see someone do something well, and you say in specific ways what you saw being done well. There's a tendency sometimes to make feedback convey your estimate of the worth of a person. It's not good. It's not good that I'm telling you you're a good person, because I'm conveying to you that your worth as a person is dependent on the particular performance. I think your worth as a person is dependent only on the fact that you're still breathing. As long as you're still breathing, I think you're a worthy person. Then we can talk about how good your performance is, but we'll be specific around the performance and be focusing on the performance. Those kinds of situations and positive feedback about performance in that way has a very positive effect on people's autonomy. And negative effects, negative feedback has a negative effect on intrinsic motivation unless you do it in the right kinds of ways. The tendency with negative feedback is to just tell people they're incompetent in one way or another, just to convey that message. Another approach to recognizing that something is going wrong is to just focus on that and take an approach to it of solving problem, of it being a problem to solve, and encouraging the other people to play an active role in figuring out how they can do it better next time. Then it doesn't feel like a conveyance of incompetence. It actually feels like support. We're recognizing the problem, we're encouraging them to figure out how to do it, and sometimes as managers we've got our own points of view as well to bring to the discussion, but it's using this different attitude toward what negative feedback means, and it becomes a whole different matter. Okay. Now, extrinsic motivation. I want to make a point here very quickly, actually. Intrinsic motivation depends on finding something interesting. That is the motivator, the interest. There are a lot of things we do that aren't interesting. There are a lot of aspects of our jobs, even if we love our jobs, there are aspects of it that aren't interesting. Okay. Now, that means we're not going to be intrinsically motivated for it. And if we're not intrinsically motivated, then what kind of motivation is there? Extrinsic motivation. But there's something about extrinsic motivation, and that is people have a tendency, when something is outside of themselves, a tendency and willingness generally to take it inside themselves. We can, for instance, set up a situation where we're encouraging somebody to do something that's uninteresting to them. We can be encouraging them to do it, but if we do that, there's the possibility that they'll internalize it and make it their own. And the primary condition under which they'll really take responsibility for doing things that are not interesting, the primary thing is if they can come to understand its importance in relation to themselves. When we're asking somebody to do something, do you provide a rationale? Do you let them really understand what it is that it's about, why this is important? The degree to which they understand its importance in a real way vis-a-vis themselves, the more likely it is, and we have a psychological term for this, which is internalization, the more likely they will internalize that extrinsic motivation and actually transform it into their own motivation. And the point that I'm making in this is that the bases of autonomous motivation, there are two of them. One of them is about interest, enjoyment, and that's intrinsic motivation, and I've been talking a lot about that. But the other is about the personal value of this activity as I see it in relation to my job. You as managers can influence people coming to understand the value of the activity, and to the extent that they really do and take it in themselves, then they'll be doing the activity in a way that's autonomous also. So we have these two different routes to autonomy. I don't know about you, but I belong to a health club, and at least when I'm home, I go at least twice a week and exercise. You know, I get on ridiculous machines And I start by spending 30 minutes climbing to nowhere. It is not interesting or enjoyable to climb to nowhere. I have never found it interesting. I'll probably be exercising for the rest of my life, and I'm pretty sure I will never get to find it interesting, nor does any of this stuff interest me, and yet I do it. Why do I do it? Because I understand the importance and value of that activity. I believe wholeheartedly that my own health and wellness over time is enhanced by engaging in regular kinds of exercise. So that's an instance of how I've taken in the regulation of that from suggestions by my doctors and medical friends and so on. I believe in it, and therefore I do it autonomously, even though it's not interesting. So we have these two things. Basically, autonomous motivation then comes down to intrinsic motivation, which I talked about, and then this is just the psychological jargon for believing in the importance or value of the activity for myself. That's really what autonomous motivation is about, those two things which can work together. And controlled motivation is really about, this again is psychological jargon. External regulation just means the carrot and stick, which I've been talking to you about. But there's one other kind of controlled motivation. Has any of you ever felt guilt? Have you ever done something because you'd feel guilty if you didn't? I have, I know, and some other people have, so I've heard at least a couple of yeses here. That's an interesting kind of motivation because it's a motivation that's inside us, but it doesn't feel very autonomous. We're pressuring ourselves to do it. And it turns out that there's a tendency when we pressure other people to do things that are not interesting to them, they may take it in, they may sort of partially internalize it, but they internalize it in ways that they then pressure themselves to do it. So that's an interesting, to me it's interesting because now it's a motivation that's internal, but it's no better than the carrot and stick because it's just like we're doing the carrot and stick to ourselves. We've really got to be in this place of facilitating their feeling like it's more autonomous and they're being supported for that. Okay. I'm going to get, yeah, I'll come to here. The question is, and this came back to the first question that was asked, now, so what do you do about all this? I've said some things about rewards, you know. Keep them non-salient, we recognize their importance, be equitable, and so on. And the point that I'm really making in that is that the rewards themselves are not the real way that you motivate people. When you try and use them to motivate people, rewards, threats, deadlines, and all of that kind of stuff, it has its negative effects. So what do you do instead? And the answer comes down to the point, one of the points I made at the beginning about these psychological needs. In a certain sense, it boils down to you cannot motivate other people to be autonomously motivated, but you can relate to them in ways that facilitates their motivating themselves. The issue of motivation is their doing it, but you can create those circumstances. This is the most important point I have to make in terms of the whole day, is that the real job for a manager is to create the conditions in which people will motivate themselves. We call those need-supportive conditions. It means you recognize people need to be competent, they need to be autonomous, and they need to feel related. And if you create conditions within which they will get those needs satisfied by doing their work, then they're going to be highly motivated to do their work. Need supportive context, and this is just a summary pretty much of things I've said. I mean, we study this, for example, by going into work groups. You can, in different work groups, feel the difference. The climate of this work group is different from others. There are work groups that I've been in, I mean, as observers, for instance, where it's like, oh my God, I just feel myself closing up more and more because of how it feels there. It feels like control, like the situation is trying to control me. I've been in other work groups where I just feel open and alive and interested. And I'm just an observer sitting in the room, not even someone who's working there. You can feel climates of places. They're hugely important in terms of motivation for people. And we contrast then need supportive climates, and here just to sort of run through it, you're acknowledging, understanding, relating to the other's perspective, the subordinates. This is all about listening, really hearing them and what they have to say about it, and making that an important input to what's going on here. Encouraging exploration rather than demanding they doing things particular ways, and then choices and rationale. What's the importance of this activity, so they'll take that on and understand it. The positive and constructive feedback and so on. Those kinds of things are hugely important. Through doing that, you're creating a climate, and the climate is going to be allowing people to become more autonomously motivated. It will be encouraging and supporting their intrinsic motivation, and it will be facilitating their internalizing the extrinsic motivation, so that they'll be motivated as well out of the value or importance of activities. And that's in contrast to controlling context, where it's all about demands, pressures, rewards, and so on. And what we get is clear undermining of autonomous motivation. Now it's about control. Now people are fearful, and they're doing things because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't, and so on, which is just absolutely the worst kind of motivation you can have in a workplace. Okay. So I'll tell you very quickly about some studies. This is a study we did in some investment banking firms in the New York City area. Up here, you've got this notion of need support. That's what I've really been trying to convey here, the importance of managers being need supported, encouraging choice and autonomy and so on in participants. And here we have autonomous motivation as a personality type. Somebody asked me about it at the break. You know, each one of us has some amount of autonomous motivation in us as a general way that we live our lives, but we also have some amount of controlled motivation in us as the way we live our lives in general. And the issue is autonomous motivation. People who come in with more autonomous motivation into jobs, that's good for us. That's good because that contributes to ultimately to their performance and to their adjustment to the workplace. But here, the thing that we can do is actually support that. By being need supportive, that's bringing their autonomous motivation into the foreground and making it the dominant thing that's going to be motivating them in the workplace. And just for the hell of it, I put these numbers here. This is all statistics, and I'm not wanting you to get into that. But the point is, look at how important, and these numbers, the higher numbers, reflect that this is a more important thing. Look at that number and how much more important managers need support is than the individual's motivation that they bring into it in the first place. Both things contribute, that's great, and so we love people coming in who are autonomous, but a lot of what really influences them is the climate that we create in the workplace. So we have a lot to do with it. And all of this comes out, and this is work performance, as I said before. I mean, I gave an instance early on of, we get that out of the company records, because this is really how they're viewed by their company. And when the managers are more need supportive and they're more autonomous, they experience the satisfaction of the needs. That means better performance and greater psychological health and adjustment. This study I did because it was, I used to work for the Council of Ministers in Bulgaria back in the days when it was breaking free from the Soviet Union. And I was interested in it because it's such a dramatically different economic approach to, and still, I wanted to see the importance of autonomy support for managers there, and it didn't matter. We compared it to the United States, and this notion of need support or autonomy support works even in conditions that were fairly totalitarian and all central planning kinds of economy. It's just. I started in 1987. June of 1989 was when the Eastern Bloc was freed from Soviet domination, and then I continued working through about 1995. Now, I wasn't living there full time. I was a consultant to the ministry and was going back and forth from the US, but okay. And then I'll tell you quickly about one other study that I did in a Fortune 500 company in the US. This was at a time when the company was going through a lot of difficulties at every level, from the top to the bottom of the organization. And I was working in I guess you'd call them regional offices around the United States. So this company had a big office in Seattle and one in Salt Lake City and one in Dallas and so on, and I was working in these various places. And the arrangement that the reason I was there in response to the people who brought me into that organization was really to do work that trained managers, in simple my language, to be more need supportive of the people they were supervising. The management that brought me in believed that that could help and make a difference there. And I said I would do it, but I wanted to be able to do research, which is my primary thing, in that organization as I'm doing it, which they agreed to. So very quickly, I'll show you that. So I developed an intervention for training managers to be more supportive of needs, and just in all the kind of things I've been talking about here. Okay. This is just to say, I was working in any place for maybe a period of 4 months. Again, it wasn't full time, but every couple of weeks I'd go for 2 or 3 days and be doing things and working with the individual managers, go with them to their team meetings and just observe the whole thing. Afterwards, I'd encourage them to reflect on it themselves rather than me telling them what I saw, but to have them think in terms of what we'd been dealing with and reflect on how effectively they think they had been able to do it. And usually they told the full story, you know. By the end, usually all I would do is not say I agree. Occasionally I'd have a few things to say of my own, but people actually, once they come to understand some of this, they can, if they believe in it, then they can see it in themselves. And when they take time to reflect, come to understand where they're moving more into that direction, allowing greater choice, encouraging people to participate, their subordinates to participate in decision making, and so on. So, what this does, Again, we always have what we call the experimental group where the intervention is, but then we have a control group who doesn't get the intervention. And so different cities where there were regional offices, they would be the control group for the research, and then after that, the intervention would happen there. So what this is showing you is the blue is before the intervention and the red is after the intervention. And here is where we were doing the intervention. Over here was the same time, but there was no actual intervention because that's the control group. And so what you see, what this measures, the higher any one of the lines is a reflection of how autonomy supportive the managers are. And so this bump up from this blue to red shows a substantial increase in the degree to which the managers working in the places where the intervention had been going on increased the degree to which they were oriented toward their employees in a way of being need supportive of them. Whereas in the control group, of course, nothing happened. It was just passage of time as things always were, and so it's the same from before to after. Then, of course, there's the question not just of having the managers change, but if it's not going to, what we call, radiate to their employees, if it's not going to affect the people they're supervising, then it's not gaining much for the organization. And so what we were looking at in the employees, one of the things is job satisfaction, their overall commitment and involvement with the organization increased as the managers' orientations became more need supportive. And this is just another thing that I find very interesting. This was out on the front line. These were people that were doing the work of the corporation, so to speak. And one of the things that I found when I went into the different places, different regions, is how angry they were at the top management. Things weren't going well in the company, and everything was blamed on top management. They're completely untrustworthy, they're doing terrible things, and so on. After the intervention with the first line managers, far away from corporate headquarters, in some cases 2,000–3,000 miles away from corporate headquarters, after the intervention, when their own immediate supervisors became more autonomy supportive, it changed their view of the entire corporation. So now at the end, they had much greater trust in the organization, believed in the organization, themselves were more committed and involved and willing to work toward the goals of the organization. That's what can happen even though these immediate supervisors were far away from the top. It can change people's whole orientation toward the work situation. So enough on that. Very quickly, I'm going to tell you a couple other kinds of things. Well, maybe just healthcare, actually, and I'll stop, and then I want you to be talking some more to me as well, or asking questions if you like. A lot of the research we're doing now is in the world of healthcare, and most of them, and we do some research with like patients with diabetes and patients with heart disease and so on. But a lot of it is with just patients in general about healthy living. That means eating healthy diets, exercising regularly. If they're using tobacco, give serious consideration to the possibility of not using it because of the unequivocal long-term health consequences associated with it. Taking medication, for instance, you know, doctors write prescriptions, give it to patients, and the doctors are the knowledgeable ones, they're the experts. The assumption is the patient will take the prescription to the pharmacy and get it filled and then take the medicine the way they're supposed to. Turns out to be the case in the United States that less than 50% of all prescriptions that are written actually get used by patients in the way that they're given. So the patients go thinking the doctors know what will make them better. The doctor writes them prescriptions, and then half of them don't take the medicine that they've been prescribed? It's a fascinating question, and if you are a motivational psychologist, which, oh, by the way, I happen to be, it's a point of interest. It's a motivational question of whether they're going to take it or not, and so let me show you a study we did here. This is all about whether, and these are adults, they're in an outpatient clinic. So they have some chronic condition, it's all kinds of conditions. It's cardiovascular disease, it's diabetes, it's a whole bunch of different things. But in each case, there's medication that's being used to manage it, or being prescribed to manage it. And so what we were looking at is whether or not they took it. So these are just numbers. They mean something to me. They don't have to mean something to you in any concrete way. But the point is they reflect the likelihood that the patients will take the medications that they've been prescribed. And the first thing we see, if we just look at the autonomous motivation of the patients, the larger a number is, and the fact of it being positive rather than negative means that there's a strong tendency for patients who are autonomously motivated to be taking these medicines relative to the average person. The second thing that's important is now we come back to the concept of need support and what can physicians do about it, the way physicians relate to patients, and again, it's the same kind of notion. Are they need supportive? Are they encouraging autonomy? Or are they just being authorities that are telling people what to do? The degree to which the physicians were need supportive is what facilitates the autonomous motivation, and we get direct routes from the autonomy support to greater adherence as well as facilitating motivation and do it. So it's kind of like these things add together to show the level of adherence. So, you know, what I'm talking about here is about human beings. And that these kinds of notions of our having needs and other people supporting them for us, but then also us being in a place of supporting other people's needs has to do with life. We see it in education. We see it in all kinds of domains of life. I've mentioned before, even in close personal relationships, for example, and so on. And so, what I really hope for you is, I'm not telling you what to do. I don't even have any real answers of what you ought to do in your own situation. But what I'm encouraging is that you think about this idea of the people you work with have some basic needs about autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And to the extent that I'll come in just a second, to the extent that you're able to relate to them in ways that allows them to satisfy these needs in the workplace or at home, in your own home, or wherever it happens to be, I think you'll find the whole situation with respect to motivation probably improves. Yes?
I fail to understand this table.
Oh, okay.
So, because I understand that the bottom line shows that what's obvious that this, you know, somebody has more autonomous self-empowerment, then he will take the pills,
yes.
you know, regularly
yes.
over a period of time.
Yes.
I didn't understand the top line about the support, because it seems that it drops, or
no,
it's their need for support drops.
No, let me. I tried to get something pretty complicated into a simple way of presenting it, and it's well. Basically, these are independent contributions. So your autonomous motivation contributes to your taking the medication more, but so does your physician's attitude toward you. So the way the physician relates to you supplements the contribution of your own autonomous motivation. So you, yes.
In other words, regardless of the patient's autonomous motivation to begin with, it's controlled for statistically. The more the physicians support you, the more pills you'll take.
What I see is the other way around. The more that you're motivated is the less you need the support because it drops.
Independent contribution.
You see it in the numbers.
So it's smaller contribution, but are independent contributions. They are controlled from each other. As if the other one, it's true that if you have the average physician, then the more autonomy you have, the more pills you take, and vice versa. If you have the average autonomy as a trait, the more your personal physician is supporting, the more pills you take. It's true that in this case, the contribution of the physician is relatively smaller than the contribution of your own internal, but still there are two independent contributions to taking pills.
In the workplace, it was the other way around. The contribution of the manager was greater than the autonomy. In this situation, it's the other way around. It has, your behaving in healthy ways has a lot to do with you. And the only point to be made here is that the way the physician treats you adds to that and makes a difference. So if the manager, if the physician is controlling, it can actually undermine some of your own autonomous motivation, so you won't even get this, as well as contributing in a negative way. So
it's very interesting to see that. I've done a project for the Israeli Ministry of Health, and you see, I think, a very different way of behaving just because you have to pay for your medication in the US. You can see it across the board.
Yeah.
Because in Israel, I think we have completely different numbers. It might be interesting to do that.
Yeah, I think so.
It's not such a thing to go and take your medication. It's not it doesn't have a large monetary side to it. So I think all your numbers will be completely different.
Yeah, probably.
How many things do you think Finnish take their antibiotics? Or will they have it free, or rather?
The problem in Israel, they take it when they don't need it. That's a problem. No, people take it because,
They take it or buy it?
they buy it and take it because, but here in the U.S.
They take it or just buy it?
Well, I don't know. It's not being tested in such a way, not that I'm aware of. But the problems are different. You see people buying counterfeit drugs in the U.S. off the internet because they don't have enough money to buy proper medication, and there's a lot of problems around that.
Yeah. Really, I think the point in this is there are lots of things that make a difference. So Israel versus the U.S., drugs are free here, they cost in the U.S., for example. Of course, insurance pays for the drugs for people who have insurance, of course, but still. So there are differences here. How important some of these things are that I'm talking about have something to do with the conditions that they're in. So if we did a study in Israel, the numbers might look different in terms of the size of the numbers, but what we find over and over that the direction of the numbers is the same. And so what I have to do to sort of talk in general is kind of collapse across a lot of things that would be additional nuances to how strong this effect might be here and there and so on. And I think that it's a very good point that you make. There are these other things to be sure. And still, I come back to the point that in spite of all of that, and we study some of that too, but in spite of it all, there's a general trend that shows up across the situations, across domains of life that end up in the same direction, stronger someplace than others. So thank you. Yeah.
What I wonder about is the boundary conditions. So if it goes across culture, across CS, across culture, whatever it is, when does it fail to work?
The answer to that question depends on what you mean by work. and this is a serious point, I'm not just joshing on this. There are various kinds of outcomes you might decide to look at in terms of evaluating whether something works or not. And until we agree on what are the kinds of outcomes we want, then we can't be sure of whether it's going to work or not work. Okay. So you might say that what really matters to me is to have an employee who's absolutely subservient and does whatever I tell him to do and does it immediately and so forth. Okay. Well, now we've got a set of outcomes and you say, what's going to work best to get those outcomes? I assume that being controlling is going to work better than being autonomy supportive if that's the outcomes you want. So, I mean, I picked it, I hadn't thought about answering this question, so that's just as a thought that came out of my head. It matters, though, the point is that it matters what outcomes you want. The kinds of outcomes that are most interesting to me, that I think are important, for example, in the workplace in general, in education in general, and so on, what I find is that autonomy support, need support, more generally, I haven't seen places that it doesn't work when I think about the kinds of outcomes that interest me.
It's worth thinking, I think.
Yeah. Now, I told you, for instance, that you can be controlling and get people to memorize facts.
I understand that, but
yeah.
assuming we want the same desirable results,
yeah.
we want people to be involved, we want people to be
yeah.
creative, we want people to be all these positive effects. I'm just wondering whether what are the boundary conditions?
Let me phrase maybe.
Sure. Yeah, do.
Could it be people that you offer them need support, but it backfires?
Well, of course, the answer to that is I'm sure there are instances where that will happen for whatever reason it happened that might occur. I will say, for instance, we did a study of people learning chemistry in college, for instance, and we looked at issues of the instructors being need supportive across a lot of different classes. And what we actually found was the people who started out being, the students who started out with the most controlled motivation at the beginning of the course actually benefited the most from autonomy support, from need support. People often ask me the question, well, yeah, autonomy support is great if you've got autonomous employees, but if you've got people who are more controlled, the best thing to do is just control them. I'm giving you this example of the educational situation. I don't have one immediately that I can pull up with respect to the workplace, but the point is that those people who started out as most controlled for learning this in this course are the ones that benefited the most from autonomy support. The ones who had high autonomy at the beginning didn't need it so much. The people who were really controlling responded to it when they had the autonomy support there.
Poor getting richer.
Yeah, it is.
Was it replicated? Did you see this interaction many times, or like few studies on it?
There are a couple of, there've only been a couple of studies that looked at it, the one I just told you about, and I guess there are a couple more beyond that, and that same kind of phenomenon appears, that the people who have the least lower levels of autonomous motivation actually have benefited the most from autonomy support. Of course, they're the ones that need to benefit the most from it in terms of having the kind of outcomes we want. And in that course, for example, in that study, for example, it turns out that the more autonomously motivated the people were at the end of the course, the better grade they got on the exam for the course. So the autonomy made a difference in terms of their actual performance.
So as a manager, coming back to the beginning of your talk a couple of hours ago, say managers ask you, so how to motivate my people? So I would presume that this question arises when you see people with a lot of controlled motivation. So the answer would be just, for those people you identify, those that need most help, to find out what makes them alive, because maybe they even know it. And if you support that, you'll get the motivation that you're looking for.
Yeah. Let me just tell you a little something right now. I don't know if it interests you. It interests me because I'm interested in myself. I felt a little defensive. I got into a place that was not good for myself with response to this question of being defensive. I don't know if it looked different to you, how I was answering or not in the last 2 minutes, but I felt different than I had any time up to that in this, and something just hooked me in my own ego in this, so you saw me operating out of a place that was not so autonomous and clear, for example. And I don't know if it looked different to you, but anyway, so I just tell you that story.
For the entire class of questions, how do we treat our teachers? How we make them more controlled and maybe we get less out of them? It's a question. I'm a student in this case too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know the answer from me, what I would be likely to say on that. And in terms of you, you know, I hope you think about those kinds of things, and that this has stimulated you a bit toward those ends of thinking about it. And is there anything from what I've said here today that might be useful to you in terms of taking with you back into the workplace? And I don't know, maybe there isn't, in which case I'm sorry that you spent 2.5 hours listening to me rather than doing something else. But if there is something from it, man, that's cool. I'd be. So, sure.
Thank you very much. I would like to say a few words. Deep thank to Ed, and like my message based on that is to test whether it's useful for you as managers. Just think about yourself as a person. And maybe it's a question for the weekends. Who are the people in your life, or the managers or supervisors in your life, that supported your autonomy, that supported your competence or mastery, that supported your relatedness? Who are these people? What did they do right to contribute to your career? And whatever you see that, I wish you'll be able to apply to the people around you, because we cannot force people to support us. It's under our own control to offer this or like autonomous choice to support others.
Yeah, you might, for instance, think about who was the best manager I've ever had? Who was the worst manager I've ever had? Or if you prefer to do it in relation to teachers, it turns out the same way. And then list the things that the best and the worst did, and then think about these ideas of, was he or she supporting autonomy for me, supporting competence for me, supporting relatedness for me, in the good versus the bad, and see whether or not the very people that you've responded to most, where they fall in terms of these kinds of things we've just said, and see in terms of your own personal experience whether it's made a difference for you.